Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon your time zone. My name is Freedom Kai Phillips, and I'm the Director of Operations for the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. And I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of this exceptional conference entitled Climate Change, the Sustainable Development Goals in the Law in the context of pandemic recovery. I'd like to hand over the floor to our chair for today, Professor Mary Claire Cordiner-Seger, the Leverhulme Trust Visiting Professor at the University of Cambridge. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Freedom Kai, and thanks to both you and Antoinette, who have been serving as our online Masters of Ceremonies for this conference. This is day 2 of an incredibly packed and intellectually extremely insightful agenda, and I'm very, very pleased that this opening plenary includes such marvelous, not just experts, but also practitioners of international law on sustainable development, especially in the area of climate change. We are joined today by Dr. Marcus Gehring, who of course needs no introduction after yesterday, but is here on behalf of the Faculty of Law, including the Center for European Legal Studies, which is one of the co-hosts of this conference, and also the Lauderpack Center for International Law, which is another co-host of this conference. We're very, very honored to also be joined by our second chair, the Honorable Justice Antonio Benjamin, who is of the High Court in Brazil, but also has an incredibly distinguished and long career leading in these areas, not just with the Global Judicial Institute on the environment, but also his many, many years of service as our chair in the World Commission for Environmental Law of the IUCN, and his many other engagements. I'm going to hand over the chair to both of them to take you across this panel today. And I would ask, especially just as a little note de pied, that you consider carefully which of the 2 sessions that you are going to attend after this one, and also that everyone join us online for the closing with the prizes that will be announced and a brilliant keynote speaker, as well as an introduction and welcome to Glasgow by some of our partners for Climate Law and Governance Day, for which this event is, of course, an academic preparatory conference. Marcus and Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marie-Claire. Good day to everyone. It's very early in Brazil. It's 5:30 a.m. here, and I'm probably still in the process of waking up, but I'm sure this panel will wake up all of us and those that will be with us. It is a fantastic panel. The focus is on international law. My colleague, Professor Marcus Gehring, will be introducing our extraordinary speakers. Among them, I see 2 very dear colleagues from the World Commission on Environmental Law, Professor Christina Voigt. She does live in one of those wonderful places, Professor Gehring, as you mentioned. She's still living there, and I think she's sitting there at the moment, just looking at the background. And my other WCL colleague, Ayman Takawi, from another beautiful part of the world, the Kingdom of Morocco. The focus, as I said, is on international law. Yesterday, we had very rich discussions on international, domestic aspects of climate law, and I have no doubt that this will be a fantastic day. Let's not forget, and I invite you to join the panels that will follow this opening with the early career scholars. They are the very best, and they are not just the future, they are the present of climate law. With that, let me ask my dear colleague, Marcus Gehring, to introduce our fabulous speakers.
Thank you very much, Justice Benjamin. And it's fantastic to see so many of you in the audience on behalf of the Faculty of Law at the University of Cambridge, but also our co-host, the Faculty of Law at the University of Glasgow and the law school at the University of Strathclyde, it's you know, a real honor and pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion on Paris Agreement innovations. And the first innovation is very close to all of us, and even the news this morning reiterated the question, what does success in the COP look like? And we might have an answer by Professor Michael Mehling in his presentation on the third times charm. That might be lucky for the rulebook on Article 6. Professor Mehling is the Deputy Director of the Center for Environment and Energy and Environmental Policy Research at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He's a research scientist with the MIT Energy Initiative and a visiting professor at the University of Strathclyde. He brings over a decade of experience on working on energy and environmental policy. He worked on numerous issues, including the Energiewende in Germany. He was previously the executive director of the center and the president of Ecologic, as well as the manager of the Konrad von Moltke Fund, who we all know in this audience very well. Welcome, Professor Mehling.
Thanks very much, Marcus, and to all colleagues here, and of course the hosting organizations. I will try to condense the Article 6 debate, if you like, in 6 minutes. It's kind of fitting, no? And guide us through one of the crunch issues that many say is a make it or break it issue for the success or failure of COP26, given that we have failed to agree on the rule book for this particular provision of the Paris Agreement 3 years, well, 2 COPs in a row, so for 3 years in a row. And if Sophie could kindly put my slides on screen, then I'll go through a handful of slides. I think also 6 slides. 6 slides for 6 minutes on Article 6. Let's see, are they visible? Okay, here they are. Yeah, we can jump right to the first substantive slide. I think everybody knows roughly what Article 6 is, but just in case anybody in the audience is not familiar with that provision, I mean, it did get a lot of media coverage, given how it was sort of considered mainly responsible for a disappointing outcome of the last COP, COP25 in Madrid under the Chilean presidency. Article 6 sets out 3 mechanisms, if you like, for voluntary cooperation between countries. The first is in Article 6.2, which allows countries to transfer internationally transferred mitigation outcomes and use those towards their NDC progress. Article 6.4 creates a new crediting mechanism. Some have called it the Sustainable Development Mechanism, which is often seen as a successor to the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. And Article 6.8 sets out non-market approaches. Market mechanisms are not mentioned anywhere in the Paris Agreement, but Article 6.2 and 6.4 are considered like how should we say, the new iteration, the latest sort of version of markets in the international climate regime after the Kyoto Protocol, which allow for more compliance flexibility and reducing costs of achieving compliance with international targets. Let's go to the next slide, please. There's been a lot of criticism about markets. There's many different views. It's a very divisive issue. Some countries are vehemently opposed. Many environmental NGOs are opposed. And indeed, experiences with some market mechanisms, such as the Clean Development Mechanism I just mentioned, have shown that there are loopholes. So there's concern that it could undermine progress towards decarbonization, towards the Paris Agreement goals. And there's concern that in some ways, it's sort of a reiteration of capitalism, of some of the causes and problems that have led to climate change, allowing corporations, for instance, to buy their way out of mitigation. However, why we are discussing it and why it's important to discuss it are some of the calculations that suggest what benefits it could bring. And if we hit the next, I think it's an animation exactly. So there's estimates of how much cost savings we could achieve if we implement Article 6 robustly, up to roughly half of the cost estimated to be needed to achieve current NDCs, roughly 300 billion per year by 2030. And if you looked at it from a different side, you could double the effort, climate effort, with that saved amount. The next bullet point shows us also that recent estimates suggest that this would allow transferring climate finance flows of up to an additional US $1 trillion per year in 2050. So significantly scale up the amount of finance available primarily in developing countries to accelerate their decarbonization. If we go to the next bullet point, please. And it's also important to remember the latest synthesis report this year on NDC shows that about 87% of countries have said they want to use Article 6 as a source of finance and to scale up their mitigation efforts and achieve them at lower cost. Next slide, thank you. But the benefits absolutely hinge on it being implemented in a way that ensures environmental integrity. And there's a lot of criticism, as I mentioned initially, by countries and other non-party stakeholders. If we go to the next slide, just sort of to get us quickly up to speed where we stand now. So for several years in a row, Katowice, then Madrid, we've been unable to agree on the operational details of Article 6. Unlike the other parts of the Paris Agreement work program, Article 6 has eluded agreement. There's been no formally tabled draft decision since COP25. At COP25, the Chilean presidency tabled 3 versions of draft decisions. The latest from 15th December 2019 is considered the most authoritative, but by no means was it consensual. It did not achieve consensus. It's not considered like a clear sort of starting point for the negotiations in Glasgow. And there's only been informal and technical meetings since then because of the pandemic. I tried to trace some of the critical crunch issues that are considered like the make it or break it issues in achieving agreement on Article 6. On the next slide, they're outlined in more detail in this discussion paper that came out a few weeks ago in the Harvard project on climate agreements. And I won't go into the technical details. It's very, very technical. It's about accounting. It's about discounting or canceling a certain amount of mitigation outcomes to ensure a net benefit for the climate, of channeling some of the proceeds to, for instance, adaptation, and perhaps most importantly, about what to do with the legacy issues from the Kyoto Protocol area, from the clean development mechanism. And technically, there's solutions for all of this, and there's a spectrum of sort of options that countries are discussing. Politically, however, on many of these issues, there's still a wide gap between major countries and country groupings. Let's go to the next slide, please. So many of these compromises that I just mentioned on that sliding scale, we're already actually in that 3rd iteration of the COP25 presidency text. So the question is, have we moved further since COP25? Has there been progress on the issues? In some ways, the political disagreements still remain. And there's even risk that new issues will come into the Article 6 discussion at COP26 that parties haven't been able to deal with in other contexts, or where they may have just wanted to agree, for instance, on the Paris rulebook in other agenda items just to get that done because of the pressure. Now they're bringing them back in. So there's still potential for disagreement here, significant potential. At the same time, those informal meetings over the course of the last year have helped build better understanding of where parties and party groupings stand, what the red line issues are, and most importantly, also to understand some of the quantitative implications, for instance, of carrying over CDM credits from the CDM. So that is perhaps the most important thing where we've seen progress that could enable unraveling the disagreements that still prevented agreement in Madrid. And the next and final slide. As lawyers, of course, we also have to think about what happens if they can't agree, if we don't get consensus, and indeed a formal decision setting out, if you like, operational details, the guidance and the rules, modalities, and procedures. Well, sort of generally speaking, as a general principle of international law, where parties don't agree, things will revert back to, at the decentralized level, their national sovereignty. Article 6.2, a majority of parties thinks, can be operationalized without having agreement on a decision on guidance. So they could continue engaging, and they have been under pilot projects to implement Article 6.2 projects. Article 6.4, however, is a different story. That does require centralized oversight, centralized supervision, centralized governance. Without a decision on that, there will be no crediting mechanism such as the CDM. So that's where the stakes are highest. And I think that was the last slide I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mehling. And I'm encouraging all of us to use the Q&A button in order to ask our questions. I certainly have quite a few after that invigorating presentation. Our next speaker is Ayman Takawi, who is the coordinator for the Mohammed VI Prize for Climate and Sustainable Development, as well as a strategic officer for the Mohammed VI Foundation of Environmental Protection. Ayman is the regional facilitator for major groups and stakeholders in Africa in UNEP. He's also the lead counsel for climate change in the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. He's been a special advisor to the presidency of COP22, so some years ago now, as well as legal advisor to the Environment Minister of Morocco. We are incredibly honored to have you today. Ayman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The honor is all mine, much appreciated. I believe I have a few slides. Thank you very much. And there's one thing I wanted also to clarify following Michael's 6-minute presentation. As Article 7 is the main adaptation one, do I have 7 minutes? And more importantly, does Christina, as co-chair of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, have 15 minutes for her presentation later on? Or should I stick to 6 for everyone?
15 slides.
I'm afraid the Paris Agreement is here treated as just equal weight for equal provisions.
Fair enough, fair enough. So I'll stick to 6 minutes. I'll start with definitions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm to speak on adaptation and resilience, and I figured that we'd start by being a bit more specific about what each term means. And as one often does, I refer to the IPCC's definition of both terms, specifically for these particular definitions. They are extracted from the special report 1.5 that came out a few years ago. So adaptation is defined as a process, the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects in order to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. When it comes to resilience, it's defined as a capacity, the capacity of social, economic, and environmental system to cope. As you can see, I added the emphasis on coping as well. And it is connected to the capacity for adaptation later on in the definition. That's also why I chose to add emphasis in this particular segment of the definition. On the slide, you can also see that adaptation is far more present in the Paris Agreement than resilience as a concept. More than 40 occurrences in the Paris Agreement for adaptation as a term, whereas in resilience is referred to 5 times. More often than not in correlation or connected with adaptation, with one notable exception being 8.4. I wanted to alert you to that specific exception because Article 8 is known as the loss and damages article. And I think it's quite telling that resilience is mentioned without adaptation when it comes to loss and damages. Because when you look at the continuum of climate change, resilience is often seen as being more in the interconnection and interlinkage between the adaptation topic and the loss and damages topic than earlier in the climate change continuum. And I'm certain that later on Hafiz will be providing far more knowledgeable comments about that than I could ever. One thing also that struck me when it comes specifically to resilience was the combination of 2 feelings that I had. One feeling was a bit more, I got the sense that the frequency of use of regarding resilience as a word had increased significantly over the last few years. My other feeling was that it was connected to a certain extent to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So what one often does when it comes to trying to get a bit more information and data, I did that a couple of days ago, and I went on Google and I looked at over the 5 years, the growth in usage of the terms resilience. And I noticed, as I think you can also on this slide, a huge jump around the week of March 22nd to March 28, 2020. I then did a bit more research. It's very superficial research. I would invite you to look more into that. And I realized that March 11, 2020 was when the World Health Organization officially declared that the COVID-19 was a pandemic. I believe that then, and that is a pure impression that needs to be based on further analysis, there was a lot more usage of the word resilience by many of our political leaders, religious leaders, experts when it comes to how we are to deal with this pandemic. Next slide, please. Adaptation in the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So very briefly, adaptation in the Paris Agreement, as I mentioned, is present in many different segments of it. But as also indicated earlier, the core article that mentions and refers to adaptation is Article 7. I won't go into too much details when it comes to that. I'll invite you to look into more for the interest of time, but a particularly important interface and interplay is between Article 7, 14, and 13 in particular. I'll be happy to address that during Q&A later on, if helpful. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So adaptation at COP26. I'll start by saying that this slide is by no means exhaustive. It is also not indicative of any element of prioritization. The different points that are identified for illustrative purposes. And I'll start by referring back to the graph I shared earlier about the increase in usage of the word resilience, because it does have to a certain extent an impact as for the framing of adaptation in COP26. As we have seen, this word go a bit out of the adaptation space and get mainstreamed, and then go back in the climate change space with a strengthened imaging power because of how much it has been used in the last few years. So regarding adaptation as a topic in COP26 as part of the formal agenda, it will be part of the CMA process, or the Paris Agreement formal process. We'll be looking again at reports of the Adaptation Committee, specifically, of course, 2021, but not only, as there were some issues with the previous reports. The global goal on adaptation is sure to capture a lot of conversation. It already has over the course of this week, and it has for many months now. There was a technical paper published by the Adaptation Committee on that. There's a plural there that is quite interesting also to note, but if I have time, I'll go back to that a bit later. But I invite you to look at specifically the technical paper. Another point of particular import is the adequacy of and effectiveness of adaptation and support provided for adaptation. This is, of course, connected to many issues linked to, as we refer to in our jargon, the FTC, so the finance, technology, and capacity building. And specifically when it comes to finance, for example, the deep imbalance that has remained when it comes to adaptation finance and mitigation finance. Article 6, we already discussed that through the amazing 6 slides by Michael earlier. Financing for adaptation and share for proceeds, both Article 6.2 and 6.4, adaptation will play an important role there. When it comes to other agenda items linked to adaptation, we have 2 dialogues within Substa. Within the SPI agenda, we have national adaptation plans and adaptation funds that will also be discussed. And yesterday over the reception, I discussed the 2 dialogues, the Substa dialogue on ocean and climate change, and the Substa dialogue on the relationship between land and climate change adaptation, which I would strongly invite you to attend if you happen to be participating in Glasgow. And I believe that is my last slide. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayman. I think adaptation remains one of the key points of discussion going forward, also for COP26 and beyond. In our tour de table, we're now moving on to climate finance and also Article 2.1c. Dr. Megan Bowman is the director of the King's College London Climate Law and Governance Centre. She joined King's in 2015 and has a huge portfolio of research and consulting on public-private finance, climate finance. She's currently an advisor to several prominent UK non-governmental organizations on climate-related investment and banking, and a visiting professor at Université de Paris Dauphine, as well as an editor with the Transnational Environmental Law Journal. Welcome to this discussion, Megan.
Thank you very much, Marcus and Antonio as well. And many thanks also to Marie-Claire and the conference team for the invitation to speak. I should say that sometimes my Wi-Fi plays up, so if I suddenly disappear, stay calm and I'll jump off and then jump back on again. So I think a good place that I want to start, and I don't have slides, I thought in such a short time, let's just talk to each other. So I think a really good place to start actually is to begin to acknowledge how the pandemic has really brought home to us the dire need for humans to better comprehend and act upon systemic risk. And that knowledge creates responsibility for us to prevent the climate tragedy that we see coming on the horizon. Interestingly enough, this was something that Mark Carney, the then governor of the Bank of England, telegraphed back in 2015 in his seminal speech, advocating that markets need to take account of the climate crisis and that we need an orderly transition toward net zero. And indeed, that's where I want to focus. I'm going to focus on finance, but I want to push it further than Carney's comments by advocating for revolution, that revolution will be necessary. So let me begin by honing in on Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, an article that has been largely overlooked by legal scholars, but it's going to be crucial to implementing the Paris Agreement and getting us to net zero. And it says that the key objective of the Paris Agreement is, and I quote, making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development, making finance flows consistent. Governments as well as the private sector are now beginning to pay attention to this article and how to operationalize it, which is something we investigated last year at an expert roundtable that we co-convened with Aviva Investors and King's College London. And from that roundtable, it became clear that Article 2.1c is a call to action to ensure that all finance, so that includes public spending, private investment, market finance, and not just niche ESG activities, but all finance for all things is flowing in the same direction, namely towards green, sustainable, and resilient development. This is huge. Arguably, the combined impact of Article 2.1c and Article 9 of the Paris Agreement could, and I feel very strongly should, instigate fundamental change to business as usual globally. It means mainstreaming sustainable finance, so there's no longer a division that we have currently between green finance and everything else. We just have finance that is sustainable, and that is the future. So what does this mean for national law and regulation? What does it look like for governments? The first thing to emphasize is that law and regulation really have a critical role to play in this climate finance endeavour. So often do discussions in this space focus on economic logic and policy, but it's not just policy, it is also law and regulation, stable legal and regulatory frameworks that help finance to flow at scale. Article 2.1c means the focus needs to expand beyond just simply increasing green to also include reducing brown finance flows, and that for sure requires legal and regulatory interventions in markets. Through a research partnership on legal readiness for climate finance with UNEP, I delivered a legal analytical framework to identify and make explicit a palette of regulatory options and legal forms for decision makers to mobilize, who wish to mobilize climate finance. So let me walk you through it. It comprises, firstly, a twofold typology of regulation consisting of two categories of regulation. The first being financial mechanisms, and the second being what we call facilitative or enabling modalities. Let me explain them. So financial mechanisms are what we're mostly familiar with, putting a sufficiently high price on carbon, green bonds, tax incentives, blended finance such as guarantees or insurance, conditional lending subject to environmental terms, and of course, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. Article 2.1c, all finance flows must head in the same direction. So that's financial mechanisms. The second category is facilitative or enabling modalities, and they indirectly mobilize finance by increasing information, capacity building, and behavioral change. So these include things like climate-related financial disclosure, labeling and taxonomies, ideas labs, matchmaking and training schemes, and technical assistance programs. And importantly, the data revealed that both types of regulatory option, financial mechanisms, and facilitative modalities, both of them are essential and complementary. And this is quite a finding. Facilitative or enabling instruments have never really before been considered as essential ingredients of climate or green finance, but the data show so clearly that they are. The second key finding from the data was that these options are manifesting in a variety of legal forms. Not only do they include black letter law, such as tax or corporate law statutes, but they're also becoming visible in a range of financial and market regulations. So, for example, central bank directives to their supervised firms, as well as soft law, such as the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, and also legal contractual agreements, especially for insurance and multi-sector collaborations. And I think what's so exciting about this work is how it helps make the invisible to become visible for decision makers so that they can see the full range of options that they have and they can apply in their local context. And in other words, they can make conscious choices. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize three things. The first, it is clear that in a COVID-19 impacted world, we have less liquidity for dealing with a disorderly transition, and that's going to arise if climate-related systemic risks are ignored or not handled sufficiently. The second point, let's take Article 2.1c as the North Star from here on. That law already exists. We just need to bring it to life. And the third point is, one way of doing this is increased focus on national legal and regulatory instruments and architecture to help align all finance flows to a net zero pathway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bowman, for this fantastic expose on the impending financing issues. And I took careful note also for all the students in the audience that they need to really focus on the article you highlighted. In our issues roundtable, we're now moving on to loss and damage. And we have a world-class expert, Hafiz Khan, from the Center for Climate Justice in Bangladesh and the COP26 LDC Loss and Damage Group, is someone who has worked on environmental, legal, natural resources and legal issues for the past 16 years. He's been a climate negotiator for 12 years. And he teaches environmental law at the North-South University and is a research fellow with the Center for International Environmental Law. He has many other affiliations that I won't mention, but we know him best from being a fantastic negotiator for loss and damage in the climate negotiations. And we're excited to welcome you this morning. Hafiz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Marcos. Also thanks, Justice Antonio. Colleagues and friends, I would like to greet all of you from Glasgow, since I'm here in Glasgow from 25th October and attending the preparatory meetings. So while I'm going to talk about the legal and governance challenges related to loss and damage, of course, I would like to focus on the UNFCCC regime. So you know that during the negotiation period of adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Vanuatu on behalf of the small island developing countries proposed for a compensation fund and an insurance pool to deal with the loss and damage, particularly resulting from the sea level rise. But unfortunately, that proposal did not sustain in the UNFCCC processes, and the convention did not contain any specific provision on loss and damage, unfortunately. However, later in 2013 at COP19, parties of the UNFCCC agreed to establish an international mechanism that calls Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. Later, this mechanism also established an executive committee. That executive committee further established some of the expert groups like expert group on comprehensive risk management, expert group on non-economic loss and damage, and task force on migration and displacement. Just recently, this year, this executive committee also established an expert group on action and support. So these are the expert groups are working very closely with the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and they are trying to identify the ways how to assess the existing and potential risk of the loss and damage. At the same time, they are also trying to identify the right approaches how to deal with the loss and damage. And also they are trying to provide some guidance, national government, how to develop the institutions, policies, plans at the national level, also at the local level to deal with the loss and damage resulting from the climate change impacts. On the other hand, parties of the convention in 2015, while the Paris Agreement adopted, Paris Agreement crafted a standalone article on loss and damage. That is how we recognize that loss and damage now beyond the adaptation. Colleagues, you know, that is the Warsaw International Mechanism was established under the adaptation framework. So Paris Agreement adopted a standalone article that provides clear recognition that loss and damage goes beyond the adaptation at the UNFCCC policy regime. However, you know, that is adoption decision 1CP81 para 51 that talks about the exclusion of liability and compensation to address loss and damage. That's still a very serious concern for the vulnerable developing countries. So at this moment, loss and damage is governed by the two separate or but interlinked policies, and that is Convention and the Paris Agreement. That's a really
Oh, and we have slight connection issues. Who would have thought that the internet in Scotland is...
Marcus, do you hear me?
Sorry, Hafiz, you disappeared there for a second. We have you back right now.
Okay. So I was talking that the loss and damage policy regime is now governed by the two separate instruments, but of course interlinked. That is the Convention and the Paris Agreement. So dual governance gives us challenges, also at the same time opportunities to develop some innovative governance processes at the national level, regional level, also at the international level. But the colleagues, you see, if we consider the crunchy issues for the COP26 particularly, this governance issue is very critical for this COP26, because developed country parties are thinking that since the Paris Agreement anchored the Warsaw International Mechanism, and that mandates to decide on this mechanism standalone. That is, developed country parties are thinking Paris Agreement will decide on the loss and damage. On the other hand, the vulnerable developing countries, we are really serious, and we do understand that this mechanism is established under the convention, and we do see an opportunity for dual governance. That would be a big issue here at the COP26. At the same time, last COP at COP25, particularly vulnerable developing countries, they proposed to establish a network that is now the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. This network we tried to establish as an implementation arm, while we consider that executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, just a policy arm. So as an implementation arm, developed country parties are really trying to structure this Santiago network effectively, comprehensively, so that it can catalyze the technical assistance and the vulnerable countries. So, so now for the COP26 is a big challenge, how to structure this network further effectively to deliver and catalyze the technical assistance at the local level, also national level. And third and most important issue at the COP26 is financing for loss and damage. Colleagues, you know that at this moment, if you look at the COP decision that mandates Green Climate Fund to finance 50% for adaptation and 50% for mitigation. And we do see there is no window for loss and damage finance. So loss and damage finance is very important and critical. We know that some of the academics, some of the NGO colleagues who are advocating for the innovative financial mechanisms, for example, air passenger levy or the maritime levy. But it's really difficult to mobilize this sort of innovative financial resources and to institutionalize those into the UNFCCC processes. So, but developing country parties, our position is very clear. We would like to access the finance under the existing financial entities of the Convention and the Paris Agreement. So in conclusion, I would like to say that this COP26 is very important for loss and damage policy regime. We would like to decide on governance issues, which must be the dual governance. And secondly, Santiago network needs to be structured effectively. And third, we need to have a clear mandate on financing and loss and damage. So these are the crunch issues for COP26, also for the future legal and policy regime for loss and damage. Let me stop here. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you so much, Hafiz, for these very, very clear explanations and the significant the significant progress that is still needed in this important area. Our last but not least final speaker is Professor Christina Faulk. She is a professor of law in the University of Oslo and a renowned international expert on international environmental law with a focus on climate change. She's passionate about legal issues of climate change, environmental multilateralism, and sustainability, and has published widely in the field. She is the new chair since 2 months of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, and my co-chair, Judge Benjamin, was her predecessor. And for more than 10 years, she worked as a legal advisor and negotiator for the government of Norway in UN climate negotiations. And she lives on the beautiful Nesodden Peninsula near Oslo. Welcome this morning, Christina. It's always a pleasure to have you. Of course, this will hopefully be our last just online encounter. Next time we want you in the beautiful Lauterpacht Center here in the Faculty of Law in Cambridge.
Thank you so much, Marcus. And I would be more than delighted to come in person to the Lauterpacht Center in Cambridge next time. Thank you so much, Marcus. Thank you, Justice Antonio Benjamin. Thank you, Marie-Claire, for inviting me here. And also thanks to all the other speakers on this panel. I've been listening very carefully to your excellent presentations. And I wonder if we had a little bit more time to discuss some of these things. Well, I'm invited to speak about the somewhat still mysterious creature of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee. And I'm here wearing the hat that you did not mention, Marcus. I'm also the co-chair, current co-chair of that committee, together with my colleague, Hasib Gohar from Pakistan. So I'll give a very brief overview of what this committee is, and then I'll say where we are currently are in the work on our rules of procedure. Next slide, please. The committee itself is established in the Paris Agreement itself, which shows that the parties, when they negotiated the Paris Agreement, considered implementation and compliance absolutely crucial building blocks of the architecture of the Paris Agreement. And therefore, this committee was established with the mandate to facilitate implementation and to promote compliance with the provisions of the Paris Agreement, which from the outset includes all operative provisions. It is expert-based, it is facilitative in nature, and is supposed to work in a transparent and non-adversarial and non-punitive manner. The committee received some more detailed modalities and procedures, which are part of the Katowice rulebook or the Paris Agreement rulebook from 2018 in decision 20 CMA1. And there it is more specifically said that the committee shall avoid any duplication with other processes under the Paris Agreement. It shall not function as an enforcement or dispute settlement mechanism, and it shall not impose sanctions or penalties and respect national sovereignty. Next slide. The membership of the committee was already decided in Paris in the accommodating decision 1 CP21, where it says that it shall consist of 12 members with the regional allocation, as you see here, 2 from the African group, 2 from the Asian Pacific group, 2 from Eastern Europe, 2 from Latin America, and 2 from Western Europe and other groups, and then 1 member each from the small island developing states and least developing countries. So these are 12 members, and there are 12 alternate members. So altogether there are 24, should be 24 people in the committee. And they're not all lawyers, and that's a good thing. They're supposed to have recognized competence in relevant fields, including scientific, technical, socioeconomic, and legal fields. Next slide, please. And this is the current composition of the committee as it is currently going into the COP in Glasgow. The members, most of them were elected at COP, I forgot the number, COP 25 in Madrid in 2019, sorry, COP 25 in 2019, or by CMA2 in 2019. That was when the members were elected, the first members were elected, but we did not meet until June 2020, which meant that the committee only started meeting for the first time when the pandemic had already started, which means that for the last 2 years, the committee only met online, has never met in person. We're going to meet for the first time ever on Monday, 1st of November in Glasgow. It's going to be very exciting. But we've had a lot of meetings, 5 formal meetings, 4 informal meetings over the course of the last 2 years. And you see that there's some seats are still vacant, which have not been filled over the last 2 years. Next slide, please. Very briefly, how does an issue get to the committee? It's a bit of a complex situation. There are basically 3 ways of how the committee can be engaged or engaging in an issue that may arise on implementation or compliance. That's either by the party itself, it is by the committee itself, or by the committee with the consent of the party. There are 3 different options. Next slide. On the first option, by a party itself, there is the case that a party can always, at any time, go to the committee and bring an issue to the committee's attention by self-submitting an issue of implementation or compliance to the committee and ask for support or resolution or help with that issue. That can always happen by the party itself. The second way of initiation is that the committee itself can get active where a very specific legal obligation was not fulfilled. Next slide. And these specific legal obligations are clearly set out in decision 20 CMA1 from Katowice. These are these 4 different constellations, either where a party does not have an NDC, where a party did not submit its mandatory information under the enhanced transparency framework, where a party did not participate in the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, the FMCP, or finally, as a developed countries, where a developed country did not communicate its mandatory information on finance, ex ante finance under Article 9, paragraph 5. Next slide, please. And then the third mode is by the committee with the consent of the party, and that links to the technical expert review reports that come out of the transparency framework. So where the expert reports lead to the possibility that the committee sees that there are significant and persistent inconsistencies of a party's reporting under Article 13, then it can, with the consent of the party, take up this issue. Next slide. What can the committee do once it has an issue on its table, so to say? It will always, or is requested to always, of course, engage in a dialogue with the party that is inherent in its facilitative nature. And in order to identify challenges, to recommend solutions, but it can then also assist the parties in engaging with support bodies under the Paris Agreement. And these are all possible arrangement and bodies and mechanisms that deal with financial, technology, and capacity building support. Third, it can recommend the development of an action plan with the party concerned. And finally, and that's the most maybe stringent measure, the committee can actually issue findings of fact with regard to compliance challenges. And this only applies in the case of those 4 identified legal obligations if they are not complied with. Next slide. And it has a systemic function, which is not yet really explored, where the committee can identify through the course of its work issues that are systemic, which means they are not with relation to one particular party individually, but that occur for a number of parties and therefore indicate that there's something systemically not quite all right. And it can bring this issue to the CMA or receive a request from the CMA on systemic challenges. Next slide, please. So what have we been doing for the last 2 years? As I said, we had a large number of meetings, all online. What we did was we lived up to our mandate. We have a mandate from Katowice to develop rules of procedure to be adopted by CMA 3 now in Glasgow. And we prepared a first set of draft rules of procedure. We didn't finish all the rules of procedure because it was just too much work to be done in a purely virtual setting, which is always challenging, but we prepared a first draft, which is now annexed to the second annual report to the CMA. There's a link here, but you find it on the committee's website. And the final slide, this is just an overview over the issues that CMA will have to adopt, hopefully, in Glasgow. These are the issues that are in the rules of procedure. Many different things, I listed them here. Maybe most interesting from a legal perspective are issues of duties and conduct, conflict of interest, but also the decision-making and voting procedure for the committee, as well as the question of observer participation. For the 2 years past, we have been meeting in private, but the rules of procedure suggest that this is now that the rule for future meetings will be that they will be open, but they can be closed if it is necessary for the committee to work with confidentiality. That's it. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christina. Lots of issues for discussion, and I'd like to hand over to the early morning in beautiful Brazil, talking about beautiful places in the world. Antonio.
Well, many thanks to our speakers. As I had predicted, this is an outstanding opening of this second day and last day of the Cambridge conference. And also, it shows that although the issues are so complicated in the natural world regarding climate change, and also in the legal world of our legal discipline, we have outstanding experts that can give us in a very short time allocated to each one of them a panorama of some of the most complex topics of our new discipline. So I asked my colleague, Professor Marie-Claire, and also Professor Marcos, how we should proceed from now. We don't have much time left. How much time do we have?
If it's helpful, we could give you an additional 10 minutes, given the substantive nature of this panel, and we will move forward the closing by 10 minutes as well, out of consideration for our next sessions, at least to give you a chance to engage with some of the questions and some of the panelists with each other.
Okay, well, thank you. I think I will begin with the beginning, which is climate change law, as opposed to environmental law, is a development that came to law at full speed. Environmental law had to conquer this space, so to speak. It was seen in the late 60s and in the 70s, and in my part of the world, or even in the 80s, as something sort of alien to mainstream law and legal thought. This has not happened with climate change law, and now we even call it climate law, as in the title of this event. So last night, in the closing of the first day of the conference, I tried to emphasize this connection so we understand where we are and the challenge that we face as legal experts and people that work with the new legal discipline. We have developed a new field of law with a growing literature. In fact, there is a flood of literature on climate change law, and with very good, dedicated scholars, as we can see here. The next question is then, taking this into consideration, how has this new legal discipline influenced those that have the last word in respect to anything that is legally regulated? The judges. And I can tell you that there are good news and bad news. The good news is that,
and Antonio, just a quick note that we have also 2 questions from the audience that we can put to the panel.
Oh, very good, very good. Excellent. So let me make this shorter than proposed by Marie-Claire. So the good news is that from different parts of the world, we see that judges are fully aware of the implications and the responsibilities that come with climate change. The bad news is that judges know very little about climate change. And I'm talking about the scientific aspects of climate change, with a few exceptions. And they know very little about the law of climate change. And one of the reasons is that a lot of climate change is portrayed as being international law, when we already have a very strong substantive body of domestic legislation dealing with climate change in general, or with aspects, adaptation or mitigation issues of access to justice and so on at the national level. So we have here something homework to do, which is to bring this type of knowledge to the judges, but at the same time to the legislators, because judges cannot invent legal tools at the national level, even in common law systems. So I stop here, and let's get those 2 questions and perhaps more than 2 questions. Marcos.
Yes, fantastic. So we have 2 questions, and I'll formulate them in a wider fashion, and then we go back to all our speakers in the order that they occurred with very short, pithy answers. First question from James Moada, who asked, how could we involve companies and global corporations? Do we need to reinvent the law around global companies when it comes to climate lawsuits? And then we have a question from Marisa, who's with the Indonesian Center for Environmental Law, a question specifically for Christina. What about the NDCs? Is the compliance of the parties with the NDCs, with their NDCs, assessed by the compliance committee? And then we had another question from Mary Claire, who asked, you are each working hard on a multilateral consensus on these key issues, pressing aspects of international operationalization of the promise of the Paris Agreement. What do each of you think will be the top barrier for consensus in Glasgow, and what could all countries do to help ensure that we reach that consensus? So if we go back to Michael and have very short answers on all these aspects, that would be great.
Wow. All right. Well, there's a lot of aspects. I think I might pick and choose. And there was a question that came up right as you were speaking, Marcus, which is unfair, of course, to the chairs, about Article 6, which maybe if I can just pick that one up and then we have it also. I'll focus maybe on the first question by James Mawanda. And it's a great question. And I think that, Megan already highlighted that there are multiple ways in which the law is already adapting the parameters within which the private sector operates in terms of financial disclosure, for instance, in terms of risk disclosure. We see a lot of voluntary action, net zero emissions targets by a number of Fortune 500 companies, including big oil and gas majors, and not only for their own operational emissions, but the scope 3 emissions of the fuels that they sell, which raises many, many questions. I think there's an opportunity space to do that, to harness those flexible, those sort of voluntary actions for the time being. In the long run, though, I think we do need to see the law and mandatory compliance obligations slowly expand and fill all the gaps, any sectors, any activities that don't already have mandatory targets and mandatory compliance instruments. A very high level answer, not a very precise one, but I think maybe it gets the conversation started. And then I'll jump to that question about Article 6 directed to me by Mila Camille from Wageningen University. And it's about the transparency process and what transparency rules would apply under Article 6. So indeed, they are elaborating some rules on that, but you're absolutely correct that a lot of the groundwork that was laid with the flexibility mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol, especially the CDM, so how to define baselines, how to define additionality, etc., will serve as a basis for how to operationalize Article 6.2 and 6.4, the methodologies in different sectors for different activities. There is, in fact, in the decision on the ETR, on the ETF, on the Enhanced Transparency Framework from Katowice, there is a paragraph 77D or so, I think, that does say that accounting has to be consistent between Article 6 and the broader Article 13 Transparency Framework accounting, but that's a subset of issues, and there's some different views on that. I'll close here. Too much already. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Ayman, is there hope for a breakthrough on adaptation?
Sorry, I was enjoying some chocolate. That's how delicious Michael's comments were just now. So regarding hope, well, yes, there is hope in terms of, and there was a strong signal by the incoming presidency that adaptation would be a high priority for COP26. And I think that was strongly appreciated by all of us because adaptation is relevant for all parties, but particularly perhaps by the African group that really worries about the balance between adaptation and mitigation. So there is hope, but it's also about making sure that we give ourselves the mean to act on that hope and get a successful outcome in COP26 that is balanced and that meaningfully addressed adaptation, particularly for the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you. Megan, is the UK paying enough for financing?
No, the short answer is no, no one is paying enough. So there you go. I could probably finish there actually. But I'm going to, let me first start with, so very quickly, with Marie Claire's excellent question. What are what are we really going to be focusing on at COP? And from a finance perspective, it's going to be two gaps that are going to need bridging. The first is the public finance gap, and that is the gap between the 100 billion that was promised by 2020 that wasn't delivered. And that is not just a monetary gap, it's around just under 80 billion by the 2019 estimate. And that's not just a monetary gap of 20 bill, that's a trust gap. And that will be a continuing theme and thorn for the entire negotiations. The second gap is the private sector finance gap, and that's the gap between that 100 billion that was promised but not quite delivered, and what's actually going to be required to implement the Paris Agreement and take us to a low carbon and climate resilient world, which is in the multiple trillions. So that's your second gap between the 100 billion that isn't quite and the multiple trillions that is going to be required, and that's where we need private sector finance and market finance. So all eyes will be on how best to harness actors that are crucial, quite frankly, to implementing the Paris Agreement, but run their own agenda. How do we bridge the gap between self-interest and public interest in that matter? Which brings me so very, very quickly to touch on James's question, how to bring corporations and to account, and I would add finance sector actors to that as well, banks, insurers, institutional investors, of course, not corporations. And you're right, James, it's going to have to happen really in domestic countries and being developed countries particularly. Two quick examples in Australia, because Australia is a recalcitrant government on climate change. So other avenues need to be employed, regulatory avenues need to be employed to deal with climate change in that country. And one of them is through litigation and complaints mechanisms. So fantastic case called the McVeigh case in Australia, where a shareholder of a pension fund sued his pension fund saying, you're not doing enough on climate change and you're not disclosing enough about what you're doing. So breaking, that's just breaking ground. And the shareholder resolutions as well. It's not just what happens in courtrooms and in legal fora, it's also what happens in other fora. And we're beginning to see a lot more shareholders begin to demand, at the very least, disclosure and information from their companies, if not something much more active in relation to what are you doing about addressing climate change. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Afish, loss and damage in 1 minute. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yes, I would like to respond to the question raised by James about the litigation. And James, that's very interesting. The multinational companies are making liable in their home countries. Now the question, how the developing countries make liable the multinational companies, those are registered in the different countries. So at this moment, I'm trying to explore a case in Bangladesh court. How can we bring the multinational companies to bring them to our court? So, but problem is that causation is a big issue to make them liable in a domestic court. That's a big challenge. And how COP26 can enable us to enhance our understanding James, during the COP, we legal communities can consult and share our experiences more. We can unite it, and we can think about allies so that we can assist each other. For example, I need technical and legal support to file a case in our court. This is how climate change law and governance would be really helpful to exchange our views. Thank you so much.
And Christina, is there hope for implementation and compliance?
Yeah, I hope so. I'd like to respond to Marcia's question about the committee assessing compliance with the NDC. And the answer is fairly simple and straightforward. The committee does not do that. The committee is not mandated to assess compliance with a party's NDC, whether a party actually achieves its NDC, because the mandate of the committee corresponds to the architecture and the general setup of the Paris Agreement. And we all know that the legal obligation is to communicate and maintain an NDC, but the legal obligation doesn't stretch also to the achievement of the NDC. That was a decision taken in Paris. So the committee doesn't look into compliance with the NDC. And just one last word on Marie-Claire's question about the barriers. In this session, we only looked at the formal negotiation issues that are at stake in Glasgow, and not even all of them. There are more than we just discussed here. But in addition, there are a number of political discussions and discourses to be had on closing the ambition gap, on closing the finance gap, as Megan just highlighted, but also start talking about a new global finance goal, because the $100 billion is a floor from which it has to go up, and that discussion hasn't even started. So if you look at the overall expectations of this COP, they may appear to be almost too much to deliver on, but success will be measured both on the formal negotiations, but also on the political delivery by parties. And if we look at that scenario, I think we are looking at a package deal. We are looking at trade-offs. We are looking at some issues being successful, others maybe not quite, but that is what we always get. And I think if there are deliverables both on the formal but also on the political side, we're looking at a successful COP, but that will depend on political willingness, which may be enabler or barrier. Thank you.
And final word to Justice Benjamin, closing this panel.
Just to thank everyone. Well, first of all, the organizers, and I don't know if Marie-Claire is still with us, and the team, particularly the young students that have been working so hard to make it possible. To the panelists that we had today, it was really a tour de force, a panorama of some of the most complex issues in climate change law, in light of the discussion that will be happening soon in Glasgow, as Professor Faulk alluded to. And I think this is just a beginning, showing how much we need to learn from each other and to explain. I think that's the duty that we have, to explain the complexities of climate change law to people. This is different from, for example, from forest law, an area that I work a lot. Forest is there, is visible. The regulation of forests, good or bad, has been with us for ages. Climate change is quite something apart from this type of legal discipline that deals with the tangible. Climate change law deals with the tangible and mostly with the intangible. And to translate the intangible to people, those that have to comply and benefit also from laws in place, international, domestic, and local, that's the challenge that I think we all have. On that note, many thanks to everyone. And I invite you to be together with the early career scholars in the next simultaneous panel. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Marcus. That was absolutely fascinating. And thanks again also to the Lauterbach Center for International Law and the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, who are so engaged in these issues. I would especially want to thank the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, not the least because of those who are here on this panel. We look forward to seeing you in the rest of the conference.